Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD student in Russian Lit.
And I'm Cameron Lalana.
This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week, we're sitting down with Bob Blaisdell to discuss his new book, Chekhov Becomes Chekhov, The Emergence of a Literary Genius. Bob Blaisdell is a professor of English at the City University of New York's Kingsborough Community College and the author of Creating Anna Karenina. He's a reviewer for the Los Angeles Review of Books, Russian Life magazine, and Tolstoy Studies Journal, as well as the editor of more than 36 Dover literature and poetry collections, including a collection of Chekhov's love stories and the forthcoming Conversations with Karl Ove Knausgaard from the University Press of Mississippi. Before we jump into the episode, I wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our new patrons that we've got joining us this month. We've got Jacob, James, Ben, Khalil, Natalie, John, Amanda, Yulia, M. Nikolaevna, and Danielle. For as little as $3 a month, you can get access to early episodes, join our reading group, and have a say in what we read next. If you're not interested in Patreon, but you still want to help us out, you can leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or sign up for our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great. So for some of our listeners who aren't, I know we were going over your background, but for a bit more of your own perspective on it for our listeners who aren't as familiar with you, do you mind telling us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. I grew up in San Francisco, where I am right now, and I went to University of California, Santa Barbara for my bachelor's, master's, and PhD. My bachelor's was from the College of Creative Studies, which was a small college started by a literary critic named Marvin Mudrick, who told us my freshman year, when I was in his narrative prose writing class, that if we wanted to be writers, we had to read this book called Anna Karenina. And so, worshiping him, and that summer I read it first thing at the beginning of summer, and then I read it again at the end of the summer. It was my book from the time I was 18.
Wow.
But we studied literature, and so we didn't bracket off English literature or American literature from Russian literature or the Greeks. We read everything, I took Spanish and French and Greek and Latin as an undergraduate and graduate student. My girlfriend took Russian sensibly, and I didn't. And I didn't take up Russian until I was 45. And that was because I wanted to read Anna Karenina in the original, because each new translation was the translation. And if you've never read Anna Karenina, until you've read this one. So I thought I'd read them all. And so I decided, being a language teacher, that I could learn Russian. I didn't know it was so hard. And that I was 45 years old. Eventually I went and took classes in Petersburg. And then I got a tutor at Columbia. And I can read okay. I talk like a little kid, and that's how I have to speak to people in Russia when I used to go there. I'm not going back until that man is gone. So anyway, I love Tolstoy and Chekhov and Pushkin and Dostoevsky and Gogol.
How many times do you think you've read Anna Karenina at this point?
I'm curious. About 30 times. I'm finishing it in Russian for my 4th time right now.
Wow.
It's the way people used to have the Bible as their book. Anna Karenina has been my Bible. What other book do I need? And it has been that. Even though it's changed over my life, it's still my Bible.
I'm interested for Bob to explain a little bit about kind of what then has drawn you to Chekhov and your book that you're here to talk with us about? Of course, not your book on Anna Karenina, even though I would love to sit down again and chat about that too. But your book, Chekhov Becomes Chekhov, I'm interested if you can kind of outline the concept for us and for those who are unfamiliar with the book.
So I was reading a lot of Chekhov while I was learning to read Russian because I could handle story. And something I kept noticing, I've been reading Chekhov in translation since I was about 20, 21. One thing I kept noticing in the Russian editions was this great story was written in 1886. This great story was also written in 1886. This one is 1887. And it seemed, why are these collections and these nice Russian pocketbooks? Why do they put so many stories from 1886 and 87? And it's because he wrote 110 stories in those 2 years. And about half of them are keepers, and he kept about half of them in his collected edition, by the way. Anyway, so that struck me. And I'm interested in writers who can produce art even at great speed. So my second favorite novelist in the world is Anthony Trollope, who was Tolstoy's contemporary. And he was writing 2 or 3 novels the length of Anna Karenina a year for about 25 years. So how did he do that? And how did Chekhov do this in these, it turned out, these 2 years? Because after that, he just went back to a kind of normal, productive writer's pace, not an insane, crazy, incredible pace. And so I was interested in that. And also, there's many good biographies of Chekhov, but the scope, I thought I could focus on those particular 2 years and see the explosion happen. And it turns out he didn't have a lot of time to do much besides be a doctor and write a bunch of stories. And that was the discovery, that mostly he was writing stories, and he was he intentionally did not write about his own life, but his own life is there because that's where else does a writer's imagination come from except his circumstances.
Yeah, it's hard to disentangle.
So I love Chekhov, and I liked learning about his relationship with Tolstoy, and I was pleased by how admiring Tolstoy was of Chekhov's stories, not of the plays, but of the stories.
Well, speaking of bringing up of Tolstoy, so obviously the title of this book is Chekhov Becomes Chekhov. In conjunction with your previous book, Creating Anna Karenina, we're kind of seeing a through line of interest in the process of our artistic creation. Would you say that you have like an interest in how like writers and like the emergence of how writers become writers, or how they, was that an intention of yours? Is this how you've fallen into over the years?
I don't think it was an intention. It was just, how should I put it? I'm not interested in literary theory. I'm interested in practicalities of how writers just go about their work. Even writers I don't like are interesting about how they work, their habits, their ways. And let's see. So So I didn't know I didn't know if we could catch in a bottle. I could not catch in a bottle how Anna Karenina suddenly became a real character. How Chekhov could, with no plan, he could just write the first sentence, the second sentence, and he was deep into a story. He was in a scene. And it was as if he was creating a play out of his own fingers, that he could see and hear and smell. And he had no time. He was about to be interrupted. Somebody was going to ring and need to see the doctor. And so he would just race ahead and see what happened. And there's occasional stories in these 2 years where you can see him making fun of writers trying to think of a story. And one of my favorite stories that I hadn't paid attention to, called in Russian Doma. Constance Garnett just calls it Home. It's about a newly widowed father and his 7-year-old son. And the father is a prosecutor, and he comes home and the governess tells him, "You got to scold Seryosha. He was smoking." And we see the prosecutor scold his son, but it's like smoke, a big deal. And he's trying to reason with the 7-year-old like a prosecutor. And the 7-year-old is too wonderful, too charming, and keeps just breaking up. "Oh, you can take whatever you want, Daddy. I don't care. Whatever you want." And finally, after the message seems to have gotten through, and it hasn't gotten through, Seryosha insists on the father telling him a story. And the father is not a storyteller. And he keeps stumbling through this story, and yet he sees the odd effects on his son. And he starts to exploit the effects on his son. And he realizes this is just like law, really. You can have the best legal argument in the world, but what's going to persuade a 7-year-old and what's going to persuade the people is a story. And he's very satisfied at the end, but also troubled, because law should be logical and reasoned. And yet it has no effect compared to this story, this ridiculous story he's concocted. And Chekhov also writes a couple other stories about writers on deadline and being distracted by the family commotion. The messenger from the publisher going, "Where's the story?" And the writer hustling away, or the writer not being able to compose because, like one of Chekhov's brothers, he needs to be inspired. And Chekhov didn't believe in that. He didn't have to be inspired. He just had to write the damn thing.
That's that old line. I think sometimes I return to this from Stephen King from time to time. Amateurs wait for inspiration. Professionals just get up and go to work.
And Stephen King, he's a writer I'm completely uninterested in, but his book about writing was very good.
Yeah.
And one of the surprises for me, being a literary snob and an English professor, was he's a reader. Stephen, I mean, he's a reader, an intelligent reader, and writing about his literary life. By far the most interesting thing I've ever read by him. That was a good book. I recommended it to my students. He's somebody they'll believe. Not me.
I trust the professor, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious, because you've mentioned in your book and then here a little bit about the other biographies of Chekhov, and of course he's not an unknown writer by any means.
No.
He's very popular, comparatively well read to many other writers in Russian literature in the West. and that has produced, of course, a lot of scholarly work on him. And so I was curious how you personally feel that your book kind of contributes to this conversation about who is Anton Chekhov, or as you note, who is Antosha Chechante, and how does he become Chekhov? So I'm kind of curious how you see your book that is focusing just on these couple of years. How does this kind of fill a missing piece of the puzzle of our understanding of who Chekhov is?
I'll say it collects. I read everything about these 2 years, and that's all. It's just that concentration that I would have loved to have for every 2 years of his life. And he's a fascinating man, a wonderful man most of the time. That's as much as anyone could expect. So just for collecting the information, and I think presenting it chronologically rather than maybe thematically or by argument, even, that he wasn't mature. He was plenty mature. I read not all of the early stories, the earlier 400, 500 stories that he wrote from 20 to 25. He was already the writer. But in these 2 years, he got the opportunity to write whatever he wanted. Finally, for the right-wing newspaper. This is the publisher there gave him space, time, and money, and so he didn't have to write the humor pieces to order. The joke of the title, it is just a joke. He became Chekhov because, as you said, he was just writing as Antosha Chechante, mostly. That was his favorite pen name. He wanted to save his real name for his medical career and for his medical articles that he planned to write. And but Suverin, the publisher of that right-wing newspaper, said, "No, you got to use your name." And that's why in February of 1886, he became Anton Chekhov. And some of his medical colleagues didn't know he wrote. And now they knew that this guy, this young, handsome, busy guy with an impossible family, was a writer. He was that writer that the literary world already was paying attention to. He wasn't just, but he still didn't feel committed. He still thought he would go back and just be a doctor. But he was outed as Anton Chekhov. That's the joke. Seems to be. I didn't want to make a case that before he was nothing, and now he emerged. He was outed. That's all. He was already.
Yeah,
he was already.
Sounded like a pretty quick overnight change.
Yeah, that's all. It's just the name. The name came out.
Well, speaking of writers, and you being one as well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your own kind of personal style of writing. Just a lot of the biographies that I've read tend to be this sort of, they tend to sort of pose themselves as being objective, as having this sort of detached point of view that maybe inherently lends them this sort of objective legitimacy. But in your book, one of the things that I really liked is you don't shy away from integrating your own feelings into the discussion and switching in and out of first person in your analysis and as you're kind of linking things together. And so I'm kind of wondering, is this an exercise in perhaps becoming Bob Blaisdell as well as Chekhov becoming Chekhov?
That's a nice question. No, I'm very grateful that I I get to say what I think about Chekhov stories. But what I learned from my mentor Marvin Mudrick as a young man was it's just you, and there's something. He was he had a very powerful voice, but very conversational and funny and quite critical. But he wrote his most of his reviews in his books very personally. There was nobody else writing them. He didn't try to take a what's the he wasn't writing from an established position. It was just himself. And my favorite writers about literature, including Tolstoy. So I think Tolstoy's literary criticism is marvelous. B.H. Lawrence, Ezra Pound, when he wasn't being an anti-Semite, and was just writing about literature. It was just one person writing. So those were my models. Mm-hmm. I'm not a towering literary figure. I'm just, these are my 2 cents, my 2 kopecks. And so I've always written like this, really, but I'm glad to have been able to write books about my literary heroes. And I don't really know how Chekhov should be read. Sometimes in the book, I'm arguing with myself, like, how could I have missed this before? How could I not have noticed this wonderful effect? How did I not know that he was writing stories really the way a journalist does, with an eye on the calendar? It seems more impressive. It's like learning about a painter that he was just doing commissions. He's just doing commissions, and he's painting as fast as he can. And some of those are, I mean, you think of somebody like Renoir. It's like sometimes you go, he's just cranking them out. That is not. He's just imitating himself. Chekhov didn't seem to me to imitate himself. He tried to get free. He tried to find a way to amuse himself, and just step into a story and watch it as he wrote it and see what happened.
Speaking of writing, I'm going to ask a question that I know Tolstoy himself said that his own writings and Chekhov's should not be compared. But how do you think that Chekhov's approach to writing everyday activities compares with Tolstoy's approach? Of course, having written books on both Chekhov and Tolstoy's work, I think you're well positioned to speak on that. Especially, I think in the opening of Chekhov Becomes Chekhov, you include some writings from Chekhov on. I wish I had written it down, but what the privileged writers or aristocratic writers take from, like, nature for free, the less privileged must pay for it their youth, and obviously a lot everyday life concerns both writers very much. Is that something, thoughts that have come to your mind, or the way they both approach this in their own ways?
They certainly approach writing very differently, and Chekhov, he saw Tolstoy, of course, as the tower, as the master, as the greatest, and Tolstoy, looking the other way, was amazed just by Chekhov's kind of looks like scattershot, looks like he's just throwing things up there, but they all stick. So Tolstoy saw that he could not work that way. Chekhov did write. He wrote many Tolstoyan stories. And I try to make clear in the book that I didn't see that as a criticism. It's just, and as Michael Denner, the great Tolstoy scholar, points out, everybody was influenced by Tolstoy. You couldn't. And so some of Chekhov's Tolstoy-like stories are really good. And some of Tolstoy's Tolstoy stories aren't very good. But Tolstoy had time and money so that he didn't have to write the deadline. And so part of the story of writing Anna Karenina was just ignoring deadline. I'm not going to write for the next issue and for the next 4 issues, for the next 6 months, never mind. You're not getting another installment. And the publisher just had to put up with it. Chekhov was a workman and dutiful, and his family needed the money. And Tolstoy could just pay the printing cost when he marked up the final galleys. This is going to cost you 300 rubles. Oh well. Tolstoy could afford it. And he wrote, and it was, Chekhov could discipline himself to sit down and write a story in 2 hours. And I don't think even Tolstoy couldn't order himself around. He couldn't discipline the bear he was. And when he did work, he was like resentful that he'd had to work so hard. The results are so astounding. They approached work very differently. Neither, however, sat back and admired their own work. And Chekhov eliminated stories from his collected edition that he was doing towards the end of his life, some of which I can't figure out why. And many readers have gone, why did he? This is such a good story. And occasionally in these 2 years, it seemed to me that it's a complete mystery, but it seemed to me there must have been something personal, that when he was doing the collected edition, there was some connection to that amateur doctor who was still alive, and he didn't want to hurt her feelings. And so he didn't put it in his collected works.
So one of the things that Russian literature is often noted for is its relationship with censorship and censors, and this relationship is often very precarious. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Chekhov's relationship both with government censors. I know that you mentioned at one point in your book that he wrote the short story Shutechka, a little joke, to potentially it could have been written as a way to get something sexually explicit past the censors. But you also noted that he had a really interesting relationship with his editors, which is, in one form or another could be considered some sort of censorship, perhaps. And certain editors giving him more freedom, while others being a little bit more, micromanaging and controlling. So I was wondering if you could explain to our audience a little bit about Chekhov's relationship there.
The humor magazine that he was writing for most regularly, called Fragments or Shards, there was where the editor had to worry most. This guy, Nikolai Lakin, he had to worry about the censorship because he had to get that magazine past the censor every week. And Chekhov and his older brother Alexander both developed a sense of what's going to get past. And also the challenge for all humor writers is, can I get away with it? Knowing the rules, knowing what's likely to get censored, how can I get it past anyway? And I think that was one of those stories where Chekhov wanted to know if he could get away with it. And there was only one story in these 2 years that did get blocked by a censor, like outside of the magazine. But of course, again, knowing that there's a censor there is a kind of censorship. And but writing for publication is also that there's a kind of, I don't think I can get away with this. And all writers enjoy seeing what they can get away with. And Chekhov wasn't interested in political questions the way Dostoevsky was. And he didn't have arguments about politics that way. And some of his friends were bothered that he was writing for this right-wing newspaper. But when I was thinking about it this morning, even sometimes people will join a conservative or right-wing group just because they feel like they have more room. And he was allowed room. And he became very good friends with Suvorin, best friends with Suvorin, who was twice his age. And Suvorin did not censor him. He could write whatever he wanted. There was never any pushback on what he wrote. And that was the freedom that Chekhov needed. So that was the political freedom he was allowed from not from the liberal press, but from the right wing press.
So on a slightly different topic, after spending a lot of time with Chekhov stories, do you have a favorite one at this point, or do they shift?
I have so many favorites. And it's like, and if I pick a serious one, then I don't get the funny part. But some of the serious ones take the top of my head off, and I forget how funny he is, and I also forget how grim and gripping and relentless, and he doesn't as Tolstoy will take his foot off the pedal. He will relieve the story, and there'll be some hopefulness at the end, even of grim stories. And Chekhov will keep the foot all the way down, and he will not let up. And the story will end, and it's hopeless. It's hopeless. And that was, we all know this reading Chekhov, but it surprises me when I got to those. And I wanted some relief at the end, and he won't give it. And it seemed to me a kind of artistic honesty. If he didn't believe there was really hope in this situation, he didn't put it in. Where Tolstoy would have. So there's some grim stories, particularly one that I like thinking about is one called Enemies, which is, when I try to remember it in my head, I soften it. And when I read it, and that was part of the experience about writing the book. Reading it live to myself, I couldn't lie about it. I couldn't lie to myself about it. I couldn't make it something else than what it is. So Enemies was something. Difficult People about a very difficult family was another grim one. And then there's the one about the poor guy who the dependents
Mm.
And he's at the end of the story, he has to have his dog and horse shot. And I have friends who cannot read that story.
Yeah.
But then there's this, if I had to pick a surprise story from these 2 years, I would say Home. Because we get this, it's comic, it's very touching. It's about somebody who's not a good storyteller trying to tell a story. It's about a little kid, and Chekhov is so wonderful about kids. And, so let's say Home for today.
Sure.
For now, this time.
Mm-hmm.
So this was, you said, a bit of a surprise to you, some of this not getting this sort of relief from the end of some of these stories. And I'm wondering if you had any other surprises as you went through your research, maybe about Chekhov personally. I'm assuming that you had probably a fairly high level of knowledge of Chekhov overall. But again, to write a book this detailed and this in depth on a short period of time, I'm sure you were really quite involved in reading his letters, as you mentioned in the book, between his brothers and his editors and whoever else he was corresponding with. And so I was wondering if there was anything that really kind of made you step back and go, wow, I hadn't even thought of that or didn't expect that at all.
Yeah, that's good. The letters, I think I read his letters when I was first reading his collected works. That these were 199 stories that Constance Garnett translated. And then when I was in graduate school, all of a sudden they were all published in paperback. These 13 volumes of Chekhov. And at the same time, there were 3 or 4 or 5 collections of his letters, and I read them all. And his letters, there's so much about the discipline of writing and scoldings of his older brothers who were wonderfully undisciplined. Not wonderfully, but terribly undisciplined. And the letters seem to me such a strength. But when I got to doing the research and reading the letters, they started to split for me. That the letters were, to my surprise, so obvious. So that's what surprises me in life, are the obvious things. The letters were one-to-one. They were to only that one very person. They weren't the great man talking to a world, as Tolstoy's letters sometimes are, and become kind of boring. Chekhov's letters were never boring, and they were always very particular to that one person. I had a grandfather who used to write kind of universal letters to all of us, his 16 grandchildren, and I didn't like those because they weren't to me. But Chekhov wrote just one-to-one. And I thought, a lot of this book will just be quotes from his letters, because he's such a great letter writer. But the stories which he was creating as a kind of, they were for all of us. They were open. I compare it to like getting to sit beside like the author while you're watching a play of his, and he's making comments and jokes. It's like that mystery. What's that? That Mystery
Science Theater.
Yes, with the
3000,
two.
yeah.
Yes. So, but it's Chekhov, the guy who wrote the play, making the comments and the jokes, and the sympathy. So it's like watching a play with him to read his stories. And I realized that was more illuminating to me. And that I got information from the letters. I learned about relationships between him and the particular people from the letters. but they weren't as interesting to quote. I quote from the letters a lot, but not as much as I expected to. I thought I could just lay out all the letters. So that was a surprise. But what I wanted to ask you guys, what are your favorite stories of any time from Chekhov?
My favorite story, I'll say, from the book was not actually one of his stories, but it was about his life, which I didn't know about. And maybe you would want to share a little bit more since you are more knowledgeable about it than me. But I really enjoyed this fake marriage plot that he maybe had going with Dunya. And I was wondering, because I didn't really know about this, I didn't really know where it was going to end, and there was a lot of interesting correspondence there between a lot of different people. It was kind of one of the central themes, I guess, right at this one point in his life when everyone around him is getting married. And you say that, well, maybe there was a fake proposal that Chekhov ended up taking a little too seriously, perhaps.
So that's where I had to engage with a lot of the other biographers. Some of the biographers say it never happened, and it certainly did happen. But the evidence is part of it. Part of the evidence for it is that there isn't evidence for it, that those letters have disappeared. That Chekhov's sister, Maria, who was his archivist, I had no idea. This was one of her good friends. I had no idea. And she knew. She had to have known. And there were just ugly incidences, and he doesn't behave very well in it. And that she was Jewish, he behaved very immaturely and not well. But he maintained his friendship with her after they broke up. She married happily, and her husband was friends with Chekhov, and the son met Chekhov, and he remembered getting good advice from this second most famous writer in Russia, this little boy. So it is a story, and it's. I wish there were more details, but the details that remain are the only part where Chekhov doesn't come off very well.
Yeah, I like that, though. I thought it was interesting for somebody that you noted who had this almost miraculous ability to smooth things over with people that he would get into arguments with or would upset. He was able to be forgiven, I mean, almost immediately in a lot of cases.
Yes, he was forgiven, partly, I think, because he was also quite forgiving himself. And I think most of us do understand, as I see that story, the kind of accidental, are we a couple? I think we're a couple. Somehow we become a couple. And just pretending, like playing house, and maybe this will work. And when you want to break up with somebody, nobody ever sounds very good. And so I'm glad it didn't spoil him for you. I'm glad it's
no, and the contrast, it really made me think that one day in the near future, I'm going to see some streaming service offer this as like an original, almost Russian literature sitcom. I could see it happening.
Yeah, I'd be happy to see somebody, some TV genius turn it into it should be a comedy. I think Chekhov would have appreciated it that way. And Cam, do you have a favorite story?
Yeah, mine's a little more basic. I haven't read as much Chekhov. This has been a very illuminating read, because I'm usually more recent works. But I will say, we covered shortly after we covered Anna Karenina on the podcast. We read The Lady with the Dog. And that one has been interesting, not only because it was a good discussion in the context of the podcast, but because it comes up in my own life. Often one time I was at I think I was leaving work, and one of my coworkers came up to me and was like, "Hey, what do you mean? What do you think about fruit in Russian literature?" And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Yeah, it's always there in places of emotional importance." And I've like, you're gonna have to elaborate in what context. They're like, they pulled up this Instagram post and started showing me, like, yeah, like in Anna Karenina and Lady of the Dog, and then that led to a larger conversation. So things like it's popped up in conversations in my own life, and so just being able to return back to that one as a point that either in conversations with Matt, for the podcast, for other people, for just someone bringing it up, has been fun to re-engage with that one.
Are you thinking of the watermelon?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
In The Lady with the Dog. Yeah, I remember reading that story for the first time in Russian, going, "Numere nastalia bil arbuz." And knowing exactly what it said and how plainly it was presented, I became obsessed with that story in Russian. So I read that story in Russian 20 times. And listen to a marvelous Russian actor read it, and so the story is also in my head in this man's voice. Yes, and the movie of that is a great movie.
Yeah,
I would like to write a book about that story, and its connection to that movie. And I know I could. I'm sure I could write 200 pages about the story.
If you ever do, let us know.
Okay.
It also as a side note, has a connection to my own life, because I think about watermelons in relation to Russia a lot, because I can't eat watermelons. I'm very allergic to them. I'll like vomit. But when I got to Russia, I didn't mark down. I didn't tell the programmer with that, "Oh, I can't eat watermelons," because I didn't think that would come up. And I go into my host mother takes me back to her apartment, and she says, "Oh, I got you." And like, "Oh, here's no booze for you." And I was like, "Oh, how do I explain that I cannot eat this?" My Russian was so at the time. So it was watermelons in Russia is a fun topic. So
did you eat it?
No.
Just out of social pressure.
I came close, to be honest. I think eventually I was able to convey that I couldn't eat it. Whenever we talk to a writer of any sort of creative fiction, of more academic works, we always like to end on asking about what's next. What are you interested of your upcoming works, or any things that's coming out soon that you want to talk about, or just in the mind, like a book about the Lady and the Dog in relation to the movie.
That I let that slip. I didn't mean to say that was what I really would like to write about. That is really what I would love to write about. I just think no one would let me do it. But nobody let me do the book about Anna Karenina either. I just wrote it and sent it out again and again and again. And after getting no interest, I rewrote it a couple of times. I like that. I think it's better to write what you want to write, and then hope that somebody will bite and publish it.
Yeah.
It's also good, I think, to write. Somebody asks you to write something, just say yes. I'll do it. I have no idea how to do it, but I will.
Yeah. It's good exercise. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. It's been a wonderful conversation.
It was nice to talk to you guys. Thank you for letting me talk on.
Absolutely. Anytime.
We'll have you back when your next couple books come out.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Cam.
Before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons that we've got supporting us over on patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. We've got Jeff, Madeline, Ann, Janice, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Jack, Paige, Jesse, Lou, Irini, Brandon, Allison, Cole, Elise, Mysterious, Donor Dude, Joanne, Yitza, Alex, Stephanie, Julie, Eli, Caitlin, Brett, Isaac, Austin, Zachary, Pat, Rob, Maya, Amanda, Blake, Shannon, Elizabeth, Jacob, James, Ben, Khalil, Natalie, John, Amanda, Yulia, M. Nikolaevna, and Danielle. Podcasting isn't free and grad school doesn't pay very well, so if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to keep the show running, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and now on TikTok. Alternatively, you can join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com. You'll hear from us again soon.